The rain had just started falling over the small Appalachian town of Elkins, West Virginia, on the night of October 6, 1977, when 19-year-old Laura Mitchell left her job at the Maple Diner. The neon sign flickered in the mist as she pulled her cardigan tighter and waved goodnight to her coworker. She was heading home, a 10-minute walk through quiet, winding streets lined with sycamores and old brick buildings. It was the same route she'd taken 100 times before, but that night she never made it. The next morning, Laura's parents reported her missing after she failed to show up for her shift at the Elkins General Store. Police initially assumed she'd run off, a common assumption for young women in the 1970s, but the Mitchells knew better. Laura wasn't reckless or impulsive. She was responsible, grounded, and deeply connected to her family. She had plans: nursing school applications due that month, a part-time job, a boyfriend named Daniel who worked at the sawmill. When officers checked her apartment, they found everything in place: bed neatly made, dishes washed, purse and ID still on the table. Only her umbrella was missing. By the afternoon of October 7th, search teams spread out across Elkins and the surrounding forest trails. Dozens of volunteers combed the banks of the Tygart Valley River, but heavy rain turned the soil to mud and washed away any trace that could have helped. For 3 days the town searched. On the 4th, a fisherman made a grim discovery 3 miles downstream: a woman's shoe tangled in reeds. 2 days later, her body surfaced along the riverbank near Beverly Bridge. She had been beaten and strangled. The medical examiner found no defensive wounds, suggesting she had been taken by surprise. The time of death matched the night she disappeared. The shock was immediate. Elkins wasn't the kind of town that knew violence. Doors that had once stayed unlocked were suddenly bolted. Mothers stopped letting daughters walk home alone after dark. Detective Harold Jennings, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force, was assigned the case. Jennings had handled everything from bar fights to homicides, but nothing like this. It didn't fit the town, he'd later say. It didn't fit the time. The investigation Jennings worked the case relentlessly. His notes, later digitized, paint a portrait of obsession: interviews, sketches, and diagrams of the riverbank. He believed Laura had been attacked while walking through a wooded shortcut that connected the diner's backlot to her neighborhood. Locals called it Clover Hollow, a narrow footpath used by workers heading home from night shifts. Residents remembered seeing a brown pickup truck parked near the trail entrance that night. One woman said she heard what sounded like a scream but thought it was just kids. Another reported a cigarette smell near her window. Cheap tobacco, she recalled, the kind mechanics smoke. Jennings followed every lead. He interviewed Daniel, Laura's boyfriend, who was devastated but cooperative. He interviewed co-workers, friends, and drifters passing through town. Nothing fit. Then, 2 weeks after the murder, a new piece of evidence emerged: a torn scrap of fabric found caught in a bush near the trail. Deep red, consistent with Laura's uniform blouse. It had a faint trace of motor oil. Jennings sent it to the state lab in Charleston, but in 1977, DNA testing didn't exist. The report came back inconclusive. Still, Jennings had a feeling. He started looking at local mechanics, especially those who worked night shifts near Clover Hollow. One name kept appearing in town chatter: Dale Foster, a 28-year-old auto repair worker with a temper and a record for assault. Foster lived alone on the outskirts of Elkins, in a rusted trailer surrounded by old car parts. He was known for drinking hard, getting into fights, and disappearing for days at a time. Jennings questioned him once. Foster denied knowing Laura and claimed he was working late the night she vanished. No one could verify his alibi, but without physical evidence, Jennings couldn't push further. Months passed. The trail went cold. By early 1978, Laura's case had been officially labeled unsolved, but for Jennings, it was far from over. He kept the box, labeled Mitchell, L. 1977, in his personal filing cabinet long after the department had moved on. Some cases, he wrote in his final report before retiring, stay with you. They wait. The years of silence time dulled the noise, but not the ache. The Mitchell family moved away from Elkins in 1981. Daniel, the boyfriend, left town and never returned. The Maple Diner changed hands twice and was eventually torn down. By the 1990s, Laura's case had faded into memory. Another story mothers told their daughters when warning them to be careful after dark. Then, in 2023, quiet was broken. The West Virginia Cold Case Task Force had launched a statewide effort to digitize and retest unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s using modern forensic tools. Among the boxes brought out from storage was one marked Mitchell, Laura, 1977. Inside were 2 cigarette butts sealed in yellowed evidence bags, the fabric scrap and a rusted hairpin recovered near the riverbank. Forensic analyst Dr. Eva Russo, newly assigned to the lab in Charleston, noticed something in the old chain of custody forms, a note scribbled by Jennings in the corner. Cigarettes found 10 feet from trail. Suspect may be mechanic. Russo swabbed the filters, extracting degraded but viable DNA. When the results came back, the computer flagged a hit. Dale Foster, deceased since 1999. His DNA had been entered into the national database years earlier after an exhumation related to an unrelated assault case. The match was perfect, 99.999% certainty, but the story didn't end there. When investigators dug deeper, they found a disturbing pattern. Foster had been questioned in connection with 2 other disappearances in nearby counties during the same period. Both women in their early 20s, both cases unsolved. In each, the victims had last been seen walking home at night near a rural highway. It became clear that Laura Mitchell had not been his only victim. Detective Lena Carter, now leading the West Virginia Cold Case Unit, stood over the reopened file in early 2024, reading through Jennings's handwritten notes. The detail was extraordinary, a man decades ahead of his time. He had written, "This killer will surface again. He's patient, he's local, and he knows how to hide in plain sight." He was right. Carter requested permission to exhume Foster's property records and vehicle registry. Among them, she found the title to a 1975 brown Chevy pickup, the same description given by witnesses near Clover Hollow. She tracked down the vehicle through auction records. It had been junked years earlier, but photographs from the impound lot still existed. On the passenger seat in one of those images, barely visible, was a small metal object, a heart-shaped keychain. Laura's mother had told detectives in 9/7 that her daughter carried a heart-shaped keychain attached to her house keys. That was the final piece. 46 years later, the case that haunted a town, a family, and an entire generation finally had a name attached to it. The press release from the West Virginia State Police came out on August 11, 2023. After decades of silence, the murder of Laura Mitchell, age 19, of Elkins, West Virginia, has been solved through advanced DNA analysis. The suspect, identified as Dale Foster, is deceased. The case is officially closed. The town of Elkins fell silent again, not out of fear this time, but out of something closer to awe. People who'd been children in 1977 now had children of their own. Some remembered the search parties, the flashing lights on the bridge, the rain that wouldn't stop falling. Others recalled their parents whispering about the girl who vanished by the diner. For them, this wasn't just a case solved. It was a wound finally stitched closed. That night, Detective Carter drove down to the riverbank near Beverly Bridge. The air was cold, the water reflecting a thin sliver of moonlight. She imagined Jennings standing there all those years ago, tired and determined, refusing to give up on a girl he'd never met. She thought of his words. Some cases stay with you. They wait, and now finally, this one didn't have to wait any longer. The only sound was the river, steady, quiet, endless. The same river that had carried Laura's story away in 1977 was now returning at home. The news of Laura Mitchell's case spread through Randolph County like wildfire. In a town that had learned to live with unanswered questions, the word solved felt almost foreign. For the families who had lived in Elkins since the 70s, it was as if the past had cracked open and spilled back into the present. Detective Lena Carter had seen plenty of closed files in her career, but none that carried this much weight. She spent the first few weeks after the announcement piecing together the fragments left behind. Old interviews, unsent letters, and long-forgotten evidence logs. Every note from Detective Harold Jennings felt like a whisper from history guiding her hand. On his last page, Jennings had written, "If they ever find the man, tell Laura's parents I never stopped looking." Lena carried that line with her when she went to meet Eleanor and Charles Mitchell, now in their 80s, living in a nursing home outside Charleston. They had moved there decades ago, too tired to keep fighting, but never able to forget. When she introduced herself, Eleanor's eyes widened. "Are you the one who found him?" Lena nodded softly. "Yes, ma'am." It was Dale Foster. We confirmed it through DNA. For a long moment, the room was silent. Eleanor reached for her husband's hand, her fingers trembling. "So it was someone from here all along," she whispered. "Yes," Lena said. "He lived just a few miles away. He worked at the repair shop near the diner. You probably saw him before." Eleanor's expression hardened, not in anger, but in disbelief. "I used to bring our car there," she said. "He changed my oil once." The realization struck her like a wave. The thought that the man who murdered her daughter had stood in her driveway once. Polite and ordinary. Charles, quiet all this time, finally spoke. "Thank you," he said simply. "You gave us back what he took, the truth." Back in Elkins, Carter's office filled with new leads, not for Laura's case, but others that shared the same signature. The cold case task force began cross-referencing Foster's known addresses and employment records with unsolved murders across the region. One case stood out immediately. Nancy Howell, age 24, disappeared in 1978 from Buckhannon, West Virginia. Her body was never found, but witnesses reported seeing a brown pickup truck parked near the gas station where she worked. Another was Linda Price, 20, last seen walking home from a bus stop in 1976. Her remains had been discovered near the Monongahela Forest. Her case, like Laura's, had gone cold for decades. In both cases, cigarette butts matching the same brand Foster smoked, Pall Mall menthols, had been recovered but never tested. When Lena ordered DNA comparisons, the results came back positive. Foster's DNA matched all three cases. He wasn't a one-time killer. He was a predator who had operated across state lines for years, and no one had ever connected the dots. The pattern. As Lena dug deeper, she built a chilling timeline. Foster's job as a traveling mechanic had given him access to rural highways, rest stops, and small towns across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. He targeted women who walked alone at night, waitresses, cashiers, nursing students, those whose disappearances rarely made front-page news. He knew the land, the rivers, the forgotten trails where people could vanish without trace. But the most haunting detail was his discipline. He never took personal items, never left messages. His crimes were clean, calculated, and meant to disappear with the rain. In her report, Lena wrote, "Foster operated under invisibility, an ordinary man in an ordinary town. The kind that holds a door open for you in daylight, then follows you home at night." The profile matched several unsolved disappearances in neighboring counties. For weeks, Lena coordinated with other cold case units across Appalachia, reopening investigations that had long since been buried. The ripple effect was massive. The press began calling Foster the Hollow Creek Killer. The nickname came from the trail where Laura Mitchell had been taken, Clover Hollow. But for Elkins, this wasn't about a serial killer's legacy. It was about reclaiming what he'd stolen. The peace that vanished in 1977. The town remembers. Local historian Bill Denton wrote an article titled "The Girl by the River," published in the Elkins Gazette. It chronicled the impact of Laura's disappearance on the community, how it changed the way people moved through town, how it hardened a generation that once believed evil couldn't hide in places so small. For weeks, locals came to the Beverly Bridge to leave flowers and letters. Some were from people who had known Laura. Others were from those who hadn't even been born when she died. One note read, "You never met me, but my mother did. She said you were kind to her once when she dropped her groceries. You reminded her of hope. Rest easy now." It was proof that stories don't die with time. They grow, passed quietly from one life to the next. The detective who never stopped. A few months later, Lena tracked down Detective Harold Jennings's daughter, now living in Virginia. She gave Lena a cardboard box filled with her father's old case notes, photographs, and a single cassette tape labeled Mitchell 77. Lena borrowed an old player and listened as the grainy voice of Jennings filled the room. "If someone ever hears this, I want you to know I did everything I could. This case isn't over. Not really. Someday someone will find what we couldn't. When they do, tell her family she mattered. Tell them we didn't forget." Lena sat in silence for a long time after the tape ended. She placed it in an evidence bag, labeled it, and slid it into the new archive for solved cold cases. Later that night, she drove to the Elkins Police Department, where a small ceremony was held to honor both Jennings and Laura Mitchell. The police chief spoke briefly, dedicating a wall in their memory, one for those who sought justice, and one for those who waited for it. On the plaque beneath their names were the words, "For those who never stopped searching, and for those who never stopped waiting." The ripple beyond West Virginia. By the end of 2024, the success of the Mitchell case inspired other Appalachian states to reevaluate unsolved crimes. Forensic funding increased, genealogy testing expanded, and dozens of cold files were reopened. News networks covered the wave as the Mitchell movement. But for Lena, it wasn't about fame or policy. She still kept Laura's photo pinned above her desk. The girl with auburn hair and a quiet smile. The girl who changed everything. Sometimes she'd catch herself looking at it late at night, the glow of her desk lamp the only light in the office. She'd wonder what Laura would have become had she lived. A nurse, a mother, an artist. The life that time had stolen. And every time the rain began tapping against her office window, she'd think of that October night in 1977, when one life vanished but an entire story began. The following spring, Elkins held a memorial service by the river. The townspeople built a small stone monument near the spot where Laura had been found, engraved with a simple line from her journal, a sentence her mother had shared years ago. "Kindness doesn't end with the person who gives it. It keeps walking." Hundreds attended. As the ceremony ended, a drizzle began, soft and light, as if the sky itself was remembering. Lena stood near the water's edge, watching the ripples fade. She whispered, "You're home now, Laura." Then she turned to the crowd, her voice calm but sure. "Justice isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about recognition. It's about saying, 'We see you now,' and in that moment, the town that had carried a ghost for 46 years finally let it go." That night, Lena filed her final report, closing the Mitchell case officially. She wrote one last line before sealing the folder. "Sometimes justice doesn't fade with time. It waits." The rain outside grew heavier, drumming softly on the windows. Steady, rhythmic, unending, like the voice of the past finally at rest. By early summer, the town of Elkins, West Virginia, had changed. For the first time in nearly half a century, the community carried no unanswered question, no whisper about the girl by the river. The streets were the same. The river still ran dark and slow under Beverly Bridge, but something in the air felt lighter. It was as if the town itself had finally exhaled. Detective Lena Carter stood on the courthouse steps, watching as workers installed a bronze memorial plaque dedicated to Laura Mitchell and Detective Harold Jennings. The crowd behind the rope barrier was small. Locals, retired officers, and a handful of reporters. But to Lena, this moment wasn't about the cameras or headlines. It was about legacy, a story that had waited 46 years for its ending. The plaque gleamed in the sunlight. It read, "In memory of Laura Mitchell, 1958-1977, justice after 46 years." Below it, another line, "For those who never stopped searching." As the ribbon was cut, applause rippled through the square. Among the crowd stood Laura's niece, born years after her aunt's death, holding a small bouquet of daisies. She placed them beneath the plaque and whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. Lena caught her eye and nodded gently. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been done. The aftermath in the weeks following the official closure of the case, national media descended on Elkins. Headlines read, "Cold case cracked after 46 years. DNA brings justice to forgotten West Virginia victim. The case that revived a town." But for the people who had lived through it, those words felt too neat, too clean for what the story truly meant. The pain hadn't vanished. It had simply been given direction. Laura's case became part of the curriculum at the West Virginia State Police Academy, a model for persistence and forensic evolution. Detectives studied Jennings' handwritten notes, his instinct, his humanity, his refusal to give up. And the cold case division where Lena worked received new funding under a statewide reform known as the Mitchell Initiative. The law mandated that all homicide evidence, regardless of age, must be digitally preserved and retested every 10 years. It wasn't just about Laura anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever been forgotten. The letter one evening, a few months later, Lena received an envelope at her office. There was no return address, just a name written in faded ink. Daniel Cooper. She recognized it immediately. Laura's boyfriend from 1977. He had left town decades ago, started a new life, and hadn't spoken publicly since. Inside the envelope was a short, handwritten letter. Detective Carter, I heard about what you did. I don't know how to thank you. For years I carried guilt, thinking maybe if I'd walked her home that night, things would have been different. I left Elkins because the silence got too loud. But when I saw her name on the news, I realized something. The silence wasn't just grief. It was waiting. You gave that silence an ending. Thank you for giving her back to us. Daniel. Lena folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the file marked Mitchell, closed. It would stay there permanently, among the reports and photographs, as the final testimony of what closure truly looked like. The town's vigil in October 2024, on the 47th anniversary of Laura's death, the town held its first official candlelight walk for victims of unsolved crimes. Hundreds came, some carrying signs with the names of their own loved ones, others simply walking in silence. They gathered at dusk near the riverbank, where a small memorial garden had been planted in Laura's honor. The sound of water mixed with soft music, and the air smelled faintly of rain and honeysuckle. Mayor June Hollister spoke briefly, her voice steady. For decades, this town carried a wound we couldn't see. But justice isn't just about punishment. It's about remembrance. It's about saying no one disappears forever. Then, as the candles were lit, a hush fell over the crowd. The reflection of hundreds of small flames shimmered across the dark surface of the river. The same river that had once hidden Laura's truth now carried her light. Detective Carter stood near the back, watching quietly. When a young reporter approached her with a microphone, she declined to speak on camera. She only said one thing. Laura's voice was quiet. We just finally learned how to listen. The legacy in the months that followed, similar cases across Appalachia began reopening. Each one cited the Mitchell Initiative as its inspiration. States like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania established shared databases linking rural cold cases through genetic genealogy. Forensic analysts started referring to this network informally as the Mitchell Line. It wasn't fame. It was continuity, a proof that one small-town case could ripple outward and change an entire system. For Lena, the success brought mixed feelings. She spent long nights in her office surrounded by boxes of names and faces. Each one was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. She often thought about Jennings, how he'd carried this case in his heart for decades. She imagined him seeing the plaque, the flowers, the people saying Laura's name aloud again. She hoped, wherever he was, he knew the fight he'd started was finished. One last visit. The first snow came early that year. On a gray December morning, Lena drove out to Clover Hollow, the wooded trail that had once been a path of fear. The trees were bare, their branches bending under the weight of frost. A small sign now marked the entrance. Laura Mitchell Memorial Trail, 1977. Hikers had placed ribbons and photos along the path, tributes to a girl most of them had never met but somehow felt connected to. Lena walked slowly through the clearing, boots crunching on the frozen ground. She stopped near the spot where Laura's fabric scrap had been found, the same patch of earth that once carried the weight of mystery. The forest was silent except for the distant sound of water moving under ice. She took a small coin from her pocket, a silver dollar her father had given her when she graduated from the academy, and placed it on the ground beneath the plaque. "Thank you for waiting," she whispered for a moment. The wind moved through the hollow, carrying the faintest sound. Not a whisper exactly, but something close to peace. The return home back in her office that evening, Lena opened the final digital file of the Mitchell case. The screen glowed with Jennings' scanned notes, his handwriting still rough and bold after all these years. She clicked the close case button and paused before confirming. Then she typed a single line in the remarks box. Case closed. Truth returned home after 46 years. She pressed enter. The system chimed softly and the screen dimmed. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the town in white. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, glowing like distant candles. For the first time in decades, the town of Elkins slept without the weight of wondering. Justice had come quietly, not with noise or vengeance, but with patience, with dignity, with the kind of grace that only time can teach. As Lena shut off the lights and stepped into the cold, her phone buzzed with a message from the task force coordinator. "Next file ready when you are." She smiled faintly and replied, "Always." Then she looked once more at the snow-covered streets of Elkins and whispered, the same words she'd said at every case that found its ending. Sometimes justice doesn't fade with time. It waits.